The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for WCB. Mr. Speaker, the very wording of the Workers' Compensation Act of Nova Scotia, Section 167, is entitled Immunity from Suit. In this section of the Act, any person remotely connected to the investigation through to the hearing and appeals process falls under this section. Over time, this immunity from suit has translated into agents, employees, or representatives of WCB not being accountable for their actions while on duty to the WCB. My question to the Minister, is the Minister aware that when agents, employees, or representatives of a service or organization are not held accountable for their actions while in duty or employment of said services or organizations, that unacceptable practices can become commonplace?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. The way the question was phrased was a bit in a general area, but I will say that I would expect that all workers' compensation employees would be abiding by the Act that overrules them, and I would expect that they are not engaged in any activities or any type of work activities that are not under that Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my constituency office has witnessed many incidents of caseworkers with no reportable medical, education, or practical experience, completely disregarding or dismissing medical evidence having been made by medical specialists. In many cases, evidence consisting of several medical appointments supporting the injured worker's position. My question to the Minister, does the Minister recognize that when unqualified personnel disregard or totally dismiss professionally provided evidence with respect to ongoing WCB cases, would this not place the individual outside anything that could be considered good faith?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. I'm familiar with the case the honourable member is speaking about. He has spoken to me in regards to it, and I have asked staff to look into that situation. There is within Workers' Compensation Board medical professionals, and we also have medical professionals out in Nova Scotia. And I would, myself not being a medical professional, I would rely on the expert testimony of those medical professionals to actually come to the conclusion as to whether the individual worker is capable of going back to work, a partial type of work, or if that individual does require workers' compensation benefits for a short period of time or a long period of time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for WCB. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to have all members of this House aware of this situation. I've never been so disappointed and disgusted with WCB caseworkers following numerous attempts, including tribunals, to assist an injured constituent. Daryl McKinnon slipped and fell at his place of employment, injuring himself on February 13, 2012. Mr. McKinnon has been examined by more than one specialist in Halifax who have rendered very convincing reports in his favour. However, it has been quite obvious to us that the goal of the WCB is to have Mr. McKinnon examined by other doctors in order to grab some piece of medical information that they think might allow them to deny his rights. My question to the Minister, I'm wondering if the Minister will agree with me that what is happening to this 53-year-old Nova Scotian is simply morally wrong.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. The member has spoken to me in regards to the case, and I have asked the department to engage WCB to actually look into that specific case. My hope, as is the hope of all members in this legislature and in Nova Scotia, that if there's an individual that can't perform their job duties and that's a result of a workplace accident, that WCB is there to support them, and that is what WCB is there for, is to actually support our individual workers when they can't work in terms of insurance and covering their pay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, that's the problem. WCB are not always there for the injured workers. Mr. Speaker, the facts of this case are simple and straightforward. Prior to his fall, Mr. McKinnon had absolutely no issues with his balance, tremors, or muscle weakness. In fact, he loved his work, and his employment record was impeccable. MRIs and extensive blood work and several visits to well-known neurologists in Halifax proved that his problem with his gait and dexterity were caused by his fall. The WCB sent Mr. McKinnon to a doctor that handles numerous cases for their organization. In other words, not exactly independent. The hearing officer agrees with this third party, ignoring the first two findings and recommendations of two independent neurologists. My question to the minister, someone in government has to step up to the plate. I'm asking the minister or any member on the government side to right a wrong and help this very polite, mannerly, and honest man. It is simply criminal what the CB are doing to him. He's lost his life savings and is becoming desperate because he can no longer work due to his injury.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as I stated earlier before, the member has brought that case to my attention, and I told the member in discussions with him that I would definitely have our staff at LAE look into it and engage workers' compensation. I'll go a step further and say that if in these discussions we find that there could be an area where the gentleman's been treated unfairly, I will ask the department to request from WCB to engage a third-party doctor and have somebody independent review the case file. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.